Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you this week from Marble Falls, Texas, the last stop on this leg of my North American tour, heading back to Israel in exactly 1 week from today. This is episode 107 of Inside Israel, entitled Mamdani. It's Not What You Think. And as the title implies, we're going to be talking about the recent election of Mamdani to mayor of New York City. Before we get to that, though, I do have a little bit of front matter. First of all, as I've said a few times over the last few weeks, it's been so great to meet you, the listeners, as I've been out on tour. You always come up to me, give me mostly really kind words about the podcast, sometimes some feedback as well, which I always appreciate. But most of all, it's just really great to hear that it's actually giving you something that you can't find somewhere else. I realize it's a very niche podcast. It's not about the headlines and the macro stories. It's about the micro stories and how the news, the headlines are affecting the average Israeli on the street, what we're thinking, what we're feeling. And even when I'm in the US, I'm able to bring you that story because of just my status as an Israeli traveling the US, but also because of the relationships I've got back in Israel, including, of course, my family, who will come up in this episode that you're listening to now. But thank you for making the effort to come out, catch me on tour, and to share your thoughts on the podcast. And sort of on that note, yeah, I'm in the United States at the moment, and a lot of listener emails have been related to what I often say on this podcast about Trump, that Israelis feel that he should win the Nobel Peace Prize. And your response often is that, what are Israelis thinking? Do they have no idea what he's doing to the US, that he's destroying the country, et cetera? And I always try to make clear that Israelis really are not coming at that with nuance. They are taking a one track point of view on Trump, which is that he is the only one who could have released the 20 living hostages. No one else could have. That said, now that I'm in the US, I do understand more what your frustration is. It's clear to me that something wacky, to put it lightly, is happening here in the United States. I won't say that the country is falling apart, but I see the chaos. I was in Chicago about a week ago, and my father witnessed an incident where ICE agents popped out of a van and they were masked and arrested workers at an, how do you call it in English? We say Bet Avot in Hebrew, retirement home, an old age home. I'm sorry, nursing home. I'm sorry, I forget the English phrase, but workers, for the most part, Hispanic, many of the workers there were coming out of this nursing home after their shift, and ICE threw them to the ground, tied them up, arrested them. And my dad witnessed this in Evanston, Illinois, which is a fairly nice suburb of Chicago. And hearing stories like this, not just from him, but from so many people about whether it's SNAP benefits that are no longer being given to those who need it most, or in my case, the number of times I've sat on airplanes on this trip and just waited and waited for takeoff because there weren't enough air traffic controllers, or my flights have been delayed, or I've gotten emails from the airlines ahead of time warning me that the flights might be canceled. Not that a canceled flight is as dire as someone not receiving SNAP benefits, but the point remains that I realize, I can grasp how this country is clearly struggling with something and nobody really knows what the outcome is. That said, when Israelis think about Trump, they are thinking only in terms of their security and the hostages. And that's why they have such a positive take. And all the other news, I wouldn't even say it means nothing to them, because that would imply they're even aware of it. They're not aware of it. They're only aware of our own situation in Israel, which is so dire at this moment as well. Sort of on that note, there is some news out of Israel. This is a very big story in Israel this week. I wonder if many of you have even heard of it. Certainly, I don't see it in the coverage here in the media, but Hadar Goldin was finally returned to Israel after 11 years. Hadar was a soldier, an officer in the Givati Brigade in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge. He was killed by Hamas, and this is important, after a ceasefire went into effect. So after that ceasefire had already been negotiated and accepted by both sides, Hamas shot and killed a number of IDF soldiers, including Hadar Goldin. His body was snatched and taken through a tunnel network back into Gaza. He has been on billboards, on bumper stickers, on our minds for the past 11 years. And finally, today, he was returned to Israel, bringing a sense of closure to what's been a very, very long and painful ordeal, of course, for his family, but really for all Israelis. And somewhat related to that, Dorit, my wife, attended the funeral today of Itai Chen. Itai was a tank soldier who was killed on October 7th. His parents had been very outspoken about getting his body back into Israel. They've also been very critical of the Netanyahu government, and they're very close with Trump. As I believe the father, from what Dorit told me, the father said at the funeral that he has direct access to the White House, the personal number either of Trump or someone else, that's how much the Trump administration has been going to bat for the hostage families. Another reason why Israelis really, it's not an understatement to say that Israelis adore Trump. But as for this funeral of Itai Chen, he was finally returned back to Israel this week, and it was in Tel Aviv. From what Dorit tells me, thousands and thousands of people there. The president of Israel spoke, and usually the president of Israel does not get political, but more and more he's had no choice but to be political. And he did make what some consider a political statement, coming out very strongly in his eulogy in favor of an October 7th commission, an official commission that would examine how October 7th happened. As you know, Netanyahu and his government have been blocking such a commission. Eventually, mark my words, there will be such a commission. It might be in 6 months. It might be in 6 years. It might be in 60 years, but there will be at some point some sort of examination of how it happened. But these two stories, the funeral of Itai Chen, attended by thousands of people, most of whom don't know him or the family personally, but it's just what Israelis do, and the return of Hadar Goldin, it coincided with an event happening in America this week, which is Veterans Day. You know, I'm, as I mentioned, in Marble Falls, and one of my guilty pleasures when I'm here in the US, especially on Sundays, is just marinating in NFL football and other professional sports, which I really just don't get access to when I'm in Israel. And, you know, I couldn't help but notice how in all these NFL games today, they're paying homage to the veterans and thanking the veterans. And it just struck me of how different it is in Israel, that there is no Veterans Day in Israel because we are all veterans. The country is filled with people who've given. It is a country where we don't have to have public ceremonies at sporting events for those who've chosen to give the ultimate sacrifice, because just about every Israeli does make that kind of sacrifice for the country, some sort of sacrifice for the country. And it relates also to today's main topic, which we're going to get to right now. As I mentioned, the title of today's episode is Mamdani, It's Not What You Think. And again, on that line of thought that I'm in the US, you know, I, like so many of you, have been really horrified by the prospect of Mamdani being elected mayor of New York, which has a sizable Jewish population. I must say, though, having been here now for 5, 6 weeks, and having spoken a lot to you guys on the road, not just those of you who've attended my shows and events, but also to some journalists and some professionals in the media and the Jewish world, I've gotten, I think, a deeper look at this election and what it means. And I want to share four quick takeaways with you based on my own assessment of what exactly is going on here. Because for me, I'm actually less afraid now of certain things, but more afraid of others as it pertains to Mamdani's election. So, number one, let's talk about safety for Jews in New York. I actually am not worried when it comes to the safety of Jews in New York City. No mayor wants citizens of his or her city to be killed during his reign, during his mayorship. And I really don't think that Mamdani is going to be stingy when it comes to protecting Jews, when it comes to protecting Jewish events, when it comes to protecting synagogues and Jewish institutions. I am actually not worried about that. Now, I am worried about a possible rise in anti-Semitic attacks, that his election somehow legitimizes the idea that Israel can be criticized, and because of that, Jews can be criticized and targeted. So maybe that is possible, and that's something I'm concerned about. But as for Mamdani himself not providing the security Jews need, I am not worried about that. I actually think he's going to go, maybe even take that extra step and go above and beyond when it comes to securing Jewish institutions and Jewish events, just because he knows that he's under scrutiny for doing so. On that note, I actually believe that, now try to follow my sentence here. I believe that Mamdani believes he's not anti-Semitic. Now, I and many of you probably think he is anti-Semitic, because you can't say globalize the Intifada without being anti-Semitic. But I actually believe that he thinks he's not. He, as far as I can tell, actually believes that he cares for Jews as people. It's Israel he has a problem with. Now we can dive into, why is he singling out Israel? Why Intifada, not peaceful sit-ins, Martin Luther King style, etc.? That's where the anti-Semitism comes in. But I actually don't think that he personally believes he's anti-Semitic. I think the opposite. I think he believes that he loves everyone equally, and as mayor, he will bestow this magical love on all of New York City. So what is this all really about? So that's takeaway number two, is that what this is really about, this election, is it's about the economics of New York. It's about the difficulty of living in New York City and eking out a living in this city where the wealthy, the small amount of wealthy, have so much and access to so much, and everyone else feels left out. It's about power. It's about the regular guy versus the elites. It's about the 99% versus the 1%. That is why he got elected. This election was not a referendum on Israel for most voters. They were not voting pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine, anti-IDF. That got roped in, but that is not why the voters who voted for him, for the most part, chose to elect Mamdani mayor. They were voting because they feel completely squeezed out of having even a decent life, an average life in New York City. It is so expensive, and they feel that there is this wealthy class that is hoarding everything and is locking them out. That's what this election is about. It's about fairness. It's about economic equality. It's about doing away with the elites, breaking down walls and barriers. It was not a referendum on Israel, Gaza, Hamas. Now, that leads me to takeaway number three. What does frighten me is that a candidate who can use terms like globalize the intifada and who can say things like these boots are laced by the IDF, and I'm not even sure what that means. It bothers me, it frightens me that a candidate who says these things can get elected to an office like mayor of New York. It says something about where this generation is politically and where America is politically, that saying globalize the intifada does not disqualify you from being the mayor of New York City. You know, if he had used an equally violent phrase against the LGBTQ population or against the African American population or any other group, his candidacy would be over. But we're at the point now in America where you can say globalize the intifada, and all you have to do is sort of walk it back a bit or explain what you really meant. And it's dismissed as just not even a faux pas. I think maybe a lot of people would agree with that or think it's not nearly as bad as it sounds. To them, intifada doesn't mean what it means to us Israelis. To us Israelis, it means, and to you, it means guns, buses that blow up, suicide bombers. To the rest of the world, to certainly this generation of Americans, it means uprising, taking down the man, breaking down the walls. So that frightens me because it doesn't bode well for future politics in America. It means that candidates down the road can say things like this and can be anti-Israel and sort of on the sly anti-Semitic and get away with it and have it be accepted. So what I'm not afraid of is the safety of Jews on a security level. I don't think Mamdani will hold back when it comes to providing security. However, I could see an uprise in anti-Semitic acts. And what really does frighten me is just this trend, this idea that somehow Israel has gotten this label, this stain of being genocidal, and hence part of the man. And that's why it's so easy to get away with statements like globalize the intifada, because it's so ironic when you think about the oppressed minority fighting against the powerful majority. I think Israel is the classic case of the small, seemingly helpless minority fighting against all odds to survive. 15 million Jews in the world, 2 billion Muslims, one Jewish country in the world, 50 Muslim majority populations. It is clear who the underdog is here. And if you're going to vote for the underdog candidate or the candidate who represents the underdog, Israel should be the country that this candidate supports. And yet somehow, in a bizarre twist of events, Israel is seen as the oppressor, as the colonizer, as the powerful one. How this happened, I think we're going to be asking ourselves for years to come. Part of it is anti-Semitism, but part of it is just our own really crappy or maybe just non-existent messaging that we have continued to make the same mistakes over and over, have not bothered to try to tell our story, probably because we thought we didn't have to, that it was just so obvious. The pictures, the videos would speak for themselves. Often when I talk to people about this, when I go to do events or shows, one of us at some point in the conversation will say, the world is upside down. And I think many of us feel this way. How Israel got lumped into the category of the oppressor, the conqueror, when there are so few of us and we are so tiny compared to the rest of the world. Sometimes the only conclusion we can have is the world is upside down. I do want to bring in the fourth takeaway, and this also relates to the idea of what's happening in Israel right now and Veterans Day here in the US. And it has something to do with this generation, the young people who, in overwhelming numbers, voted for Mamdani, including many young Jews. I used to live in New York when I was really young, right out of college before I went to do the army in Israel. I lived for a year in New York City. It's where I first started doing comedy. And it was a tough existence. It was expensive. I lived in a basement apartment in Brooklyn with no windows. It was musty. It was moldy. I don't think I even had an oven, just an electric stovetop. It was filthy. There were mice. But at the same time, I didn't think I was entitled to something better. I knew that it was my choice to live in New York. I knew it was my choice to pursue comedy. My days were pretty packed. I'd be up by 6:30 on a subway train into Manhattan from Brooklyn, over an hour ride, the F train to Midtown or to the Wall Street area where I would temp, doing everything from data entry to answering the phones. And it was hard. And then at night, of course, I would go out and do comedy. It was very difficult. And yet I never felt that I was entitled to something better. And I didn't really hold a grudge against those who were wealthier than I was for having what they had. It seemed obvious to me that my job at that point was to work my way up the ladder and to make as much of an effort as I could. I do think there's something different in this generation right now of Mamdani voters. And this is also something I've gleaned from the conversations I've had with a lot of you out on the road at various conferences, shows, and events. I think a lot of us agree that this generation, there's a sense of entitlement to them that previous generations didn't have. They followed all the rules, they took the AP classes, had the great GPAs, wrote outstanding essays to get into good colleges, often not the top colleges, the Harvards, the Penns, the Columbias, but to one level down. And don't get offended here if I mention your college, but the Williamses and the Bateses and the Muhlenbergs, just one maybe step down from the Ivies. And they went to these semi-prestigious schools, and now they find themselves really struggling to make it in New York, but they feel that they're entitled to something better. Maybe it's because they were given a lot and never really had to fight for anything themselves. I'm just theorizing here. But it does seem that they have a sense of entitlement about them and that they believe someone like Mamdani can right the wrongs and can fix this fact that they find themselves not getting what they think they deserve. So I think it's a generational question as well. I want to address the questions that you guys sent in because we had some great questions coming in this week, some that were really enlightening, and three of them are actually related to Mamdani and the election. Our first two are very similar, so I'm going to read them together. This one is from Donna. She writes, I can't stand the fact that Mamdani, an anti-Zionist, got elected. But even more, I really don't understand why some Jews, including rabbis, voted for him. Why is this? And Alan writes something similar. We were astonished that Bend the Arc and other left-leaning Jewish nonprofits supported Mamdani. So I want to divide the groups that you're talking about into two separate categories. First, there's the general population, and then there's the rabbis and the nonprofit leaders. Okay, so let's talk about the general population, the Jews who voted for Mamdani. What you need to realize is that their Israel is not my Israel and your Israel. My Israel is the one that was a safe haven for Jews. after the Holocaust. My Israel is the promise that Jews will never have to worry about being exterminated again, because finally we have a homeland of our own, we have an army of our own. That's what my Israel is, and that's what probably most of your Israel stands for. What you need to understand is that for many young Jews, Israel has nothing to do with those concepts. It is completely divorced from the idea of being a refuge from anti-Semitism in the Holocaust. It has nothing to do with being safe and Jewish self-determination. For young Jews, especially young Jews who grew up in good societies in the US and Canada, good neighborhoods, for them, Jews in their mind have access to the societies around them. They can become powerful. They can get any job they want. They can succeed. They see Jews with a lot of wealth. They don't think that Jews need a homeland of their own. And if they do see anti-Semitism, their first instinct might be that Jews did something to deserve it. So you need to understand, and this is something I need to understand too, that I'm waking up to, is that for a lot of young Jews, their Israel is not my Israel. It is a completely different country to them than it is to me. That is why they can vote for someone like Mamdani. Because when you tell them, yeah, but he's anti-Israel, the reaction is not, no, he's not. The reaction is, yeah, he should be anti-Israel. Look what Israel is doing. Look how Israel murders. Look how Israel kills innocents during a war in a disproportionate number, etc. So it's not that they're denying that Mamdani is anti-Israel. They would actually embrace it, that Israel deserves to be called out and criticized and defunded and boycotted. Their Israel is not our Israel. Now, as for the rabbis who support Mamdani, I'm going to say something completely not politically correct here, okay? But I'm going to say it anyway. When it comes to the rabbis who put on a talit and stood in Grand Central Station protesting Israel, and other rabbis who are really vocally anti-Israel, these are not the highest level rabbis out there right now. These are often rabbis who didn't get their smicha, who didn't get their ordination from the institutions that you and I recognize. They got them from sort of startup, smaller institutions. These are not rabbis that you could sit down and really dig into a piece of Talmud with them and talk about Jewish law. For them, Judaism is mostly about doing good deeds and tikkun olam. And look, not that tikkun olam isn't important, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we think tikkun olam is the only way, making the world better, is the only way or the only ingredient necessary for Jewish life, Jewish continuity. These rabbis, when I've met them, did not impress me with their intellect. They did not impress me with their depth of knowledge of Jewish culture and Jewish texts. So, on the one hand, you got to take that into account. These are also a lot of rabbis, and I know a few of them, and I guess I'm making a big judgment based on the few I know, but I do think it applies. These are rabbis who, in general, I can sort of tell have always been a little bit outside the mainstream. They've always been on the edges, on the fringe, not the most popular ones in school, looking for an identity. And I think calling out Israel is a deep psychological way to get back at all the bullies that they suffered from during their own lives up to this point, and probably still feel overwhelmed and intimidated by right now. I really do believe when it comes to anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment, it's rarely about the Green Line or water rights or land swaps. It's usually about something so deeply personal and psychologically scarred in that person, something they're uncomfortable talking about in everyday life. But Israel and Judaism gives them this golden opportunity to finally vent all this frustration and anger they have in a legitimate way, in a way that won't get them called out. So we need to see anti-Semitism is very unique in this way. And being anti-Israel is very unique in this way too. It's very freeing for those who are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And this relates also to what I said before about those who voted for Mamdani, the younger generation. This is a generation who I think many of them are really insulted and disappointed and ashamed that someone like them, with their high SAT scores and awesome essays and stellar recommendations from high school teachers and degrees from these prestigious colleges, can't afford to live in New York, aren't making it big time the way they thought they'd always deserved. And I think that frustration, instead of looking in the mirror and saying, maybe I need to work harder, maybe the world isn't as fair as I thought, instead they're taking it out on quote unquote the man. And Israel and Jews represent the top of this power structure for reasons that aren't logical, yet have been so endemic to how they've been raised that it's in their DNA and it's hard for them to even question it. So why do Jews vote for Mamdani? Why are Jews anti-Zionist? I think there's a lot more to it than just policy. In fact, I think it has little to do with policy. I think it's deeply psychological. Sue writes in with a question, and it's kind of long, but it's so poignant that I hope you can follow as I read it. Here we go. Regarding the Mamdani election, there was a big gap between those who lived in New York City a long time, who mostly voted for Cuomo, versus recent residents who voted overwhelmingly for Mamdani. It's caused a real rift among Jews. 66% of Jews voted for Cuomo, 33% for Mamdani, according to exit polls. My question is, do you think Jews in New York City can bridge their differences? And she points out that already our member of Congress, Richie Torres, is being challenged by a man who uses the genocide charge against Torres, who gets substantial support from AIPAC and conservative Jews. Great question and a great insight. I love this insight that those who've been living in New York for a long time, in general, not even talking about Jews here, but those who've lived in New York for a long time voted for Cuomo, whereas recent residents to New York voted for Mamdani. To me, that just reiterates everything I said before, that this is about power structures. It's about those who are already embedded in the system versus those who are new and think they deserve better. But it also, I think, speaks to naivete. And I think those who live in the city longer know what a mayor really needs to do and know what a mayor is actually capable of doing. Whereas newer residents to the city are sort of living in fairyland, la la land, where they think a mayor can come in, wave a magic wand, and make buses free and groceries cheap and fix their lives with a sweep of his magic wand. Whereas those who live in the city longer are a little more hardened and know what it actually means to be mayor. In any case, the heart of the question is, can we bridge the gap between those younger, newer to the city Jews and older, more established Jews, not just in New York, but I think in America in general? I think it's up to us, the older, more established generation, to reach out to them and speak to them on their terms. You know, for a long time, as I've been touring around, I've noticed just how much Judaism is changing here in the US. And sometimes I've been disappointed with what I see. I'll go to a synagogue service on a Saturday morning and I'll see that it's mostly empty and that most of the attendants are older and that those who are younger, the few that are younger, don't know the tunes and can't sing along. And I've sometimes thought, wow, this really might be the end of a certain type of Judaism in America. But Yehuda Kurtzer, who I used to go to synagogue with when we lived in Riverdale, and who was at the Hartman Institute, His retort to this would be that Judaism isn't going away. It's just changing. That for the young generation, Judaism is still going to be part of their lives. It just might not look like the Judaism that you know and that I know. And that this is actually natural and that Judaism has always been like this. For us, going to synagogue, or at least for me, going to synagogue is a core tenement of being Jewish. Doesn't mean I always go, but it's still a core tenement. And I am going more in Israel, by the way, now that I've found a couple synagogues that I really like. But for thousands of years, there was no such thing as Jewish prayer. It was sacrifices. We only have Jewish prayer because the temple went away and sacrifices went away. And it could be that we're in the midst of another transition now where prayer slowly goes away or doesn't become as central. And instead, something else takes over. I'm not sure what that is. It might be a blend of culture, of music, of ruach and spirit and tikkun olam. And we might say, yeah, but that's not enough to sustain the Jewish people. But back when prayer came along, I'm sure those who did sacrifices thought that won't sustain the Jewish people. You need to sacrifice a lamb and a she-goat. And yet Judaism does adapt. So I think we need to take Yehuda Kurtzer's words to heart here. How does this relate to the question that Sue asked? It means we need to go to the younger generation of Jews and try to reach them where they are at Jewishly. And in terms of Israel, to reach them where they are at. Instead of saying, you're wrong, there's only one way. I think we have to try to bridge the gap by speaking to them on their terms. I need to do some deeper thinking of exactly what would that look like? What would that mean? The first thing that comes to mind is getting them into face-to-face conversations with young Israelis their age and showing them that they're really not all that different from how they are. I think one thing that's happened to Israel is that Israelis have just been painted with a broad brushstroke as, monsters who bomb Gaza and kill innocents. But so few of the young generation have actually had a good conversation with an Israeli and talked about what life is like in Israel. To me, that would be an obvious first step. I've said this before, that as great as Birthright is, bringing all these young Jews to Israel, that what I actually would prefer is a reverse Birthright, where we bring a lot of young Israelis to America, not just to interact with American Jews, but also to show Israelis what Judaism can look like, because Judaism needs to undergo a little bit of a change in Israel as well. It can't just be black and white, Orthodox or nothing. So in terms of how do we bridge this gap, I think instead of trying to convince them that we're right, we need to meet younger Jews where they are and introduce them to an Israel that's more personal and more intimate than the one they're seeing in the headlines. But that is up to us. I'm not going to assume that they're going to go seek that out on their own. One more question. This one's from Elias. He writes, weeks ago, I read somewhere that there was a bill before the Knesset that for anyone convicted of terrorism in Israel, the sentence should always be death. This obviously would remove at least one incentive for Hamas or any other terror group to take hostages. What do you think? Well, first, some backstory. Israel does have the death penalty, but it's only been used once in its entire 77-year history. It was used against Eichmann in the famous Eichmann trials in Israel. He was hanged after having been found guilty. And otherwise, although we do have the death penalty, it's never been used in Israel. And in general, in Judaism, although the death penalty does exist in Jewish law, the rabbis were very, very hesitant to ever use it, and always went out of their way to put up obstacles because, look, it's final. And there's no way to pardon someone after the fact once he has been put to death for a crime he actually didn't commit. So yes, there is this bill in the Knesset that would make participants in terror, that they would be put to death. And Elias asks, or he states, that this would remove one incentive for the taking of hostages, because by being involved in terror and taking hostages, Hamas would now not want to do that because they know that the death penalty would be awaiting them. I actually disagree with Elias on this one. I think, if anything, what we've learned from our enemies is that they adore death, they court death, and I can't think of anything that would make them prouder as a martyr than to be put to death for terrorism. So I think this is actually counterintuitive and counter to what Israel's best interests are. I don't think the death penalty would actually cut down on the amount of terror that's committed. If anything, it could lead to an increase, because what our enemies want most of all is to be a martyr. And so I actually don't agree with Elias here. I'm going to take the counter argument and say that it would actually lead to more harm than good. That's it for this week's episode of Inside Israel. Our next live broadcast will take place on Monday, November 17th at 12 noon Eastern Time, and I will be broadcasting from Israel. I'm flying next Sunday, which is why it will not be a Sunday episode. So Monday, 11/17, or as we say in Israel, 17/11 at 12 noon Eastern Time. If you need the link to the live broadcast, sign up for the newsletter, Hebrew is Magic. You can do that at joelchasnoff.com as well. That is where you can find the links to Apple and Spotify to download the audio-only versions of this podcast. Thank you so much for listening this week, and I'm so glad to have you as part of the Inside Israel family. Lehitraot.